This is the Rockefeller Secret, the terrifying story of how the richest family on earth hid a cannibal massacre. For 50 years, the world was told that Michael Rockefeller, the golden prince of this dynasty, tragically drowned in the jungles of New Guinea. That was a lie. Classified files and tribal witnesses reveal a truth far darker than the ocean. Michael survived the swim only to crawl onto the shore of the Asmat tribe, warriors seeking revenge for a colonial crime. They saw no Rockefeller. They saw only a sacrifice. They speared him, beheaded him, and in a final act of primal justice, they consumed him. In that terrifying moment, the Rockefeller name meant nothing. The heir to the world's greatest fortune was reduced to mere prey. This is the gruesome story of how Western arrogance met its end on a muddy riverbank. It was a dirty, brutal death, the exact opposite of the life Michael was bred for. He was the crown prince of an empire forged on oil and absolute control. His grandfather didn't just build a business, he conquered the world, handing down a dangerous belief that everything and everyone could be owned. Michael walked into the jungle armed with this inheritance. He thought nature was just another asset to be managed, and his surname was a shield. He didn't realize that in the Asmat world, the Rockefeller name wasn't a currency. It was a curse. As the empire expanded globally in the 20th century, seeking new resources in the jungles of South America and the islands of the Pacific, it carried this specific brand of arrogance with it. The Rockefellers believed they could control nature and primitive societies, just as they controlled oil refineries and U.S. senators. They believed their name was a shield that could repel arrows and spears, just as it repelled lawsuits. This belief, this fatal inherited arrogance, would eventually lead a young Michael Rockefeller to stand on the edge of a catamaran in New Guinea in 1961. He would look at a dark, turbulent sea and decide that he could swim across it because he was a Rockefeller, and Rockefellers do not drown. He didn't know it yet, but he was swimming against the current of his own family's karma. The devil bill gene, the belief that you can cheat everyone and get away with it, was about to meet a force it couldn't bribe, couldn't buy, and couldn't intimidate. The jungle was waiting to collect the debt that began with a bottle of fake cancer cure in 1850. If the first act of the Rockefeller tragedy was defined by the raw accumulation of capital through the cynical mechanisms of Devil Bill and the monopolistic ruthlessness of John D., the second act was defined by a far more insidious accumulation, hubris. By the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller dynasty had evolved. They were no longer merely robber barons attempting to corner the market on kerosene. They were now attempting to corner the market on culture, politics, and the very history of the human race. The transition from the ruthless grandfather to the ambitious grandson shifted the family pathology from economic predation to a form of high-stakes cultural imperialism. It was this specific strain of arrogance, the unshakable belief that the world is a supermarket for the American elite, that would send Michael Rockefeller on a one-way trip to the Stone Age. The architect of this new era, and the unwitting author of his son's demise, was Nelson Rockefeller. A man of boundless energy, charisma, and ego, Nelson was determined to sanitize the family name by pivoting from the dirty business of oil to the sparkling world of public service and high art. He served as the governor of New York and would later become the vice president of the United States, cementing the family's transition into the closest thing America had to royalty. But Nelson's most relevant contribution to the forensic timeline of his son's death was his obsession with primitive art. In 1954, Nelson founded the Museum of Primitive Art on West 54th Street in New York City. This was a radical move at the time. He viewed the sacred totems, masks, ceremonial shields, and carvings of indigenous tribes not merely as anthropological artifacts to be studied, but as aesthetic masterpieces to be acquired. To Nelson, a relentless collector, these objects were trophies. They represented the raw, unfiltered energy of humanity, and like the oil fields his grandfather had conquered, he believed they belonged in the possession of the Rockefellers. He instilled in his children the idea that there was no corner of the globe too remote, no culture too sacred, and no object too forbidden for a Rockefeller to access. This worldview had a profound impact on the psychological formation of his son Michael. Born in 1938, Michael grew up in a gilded cage where indigenous cultures were reduced to coffee table books and polite cocktail party conversation. He was quiet, artistic, and desperate to distinguish himself in a family of titans. Rather than sitting in a boardroom at Standard Oil reviewing spreadsheets, he yearned to be an explorer. He wanted to be the one to bring back the trophies for his father's museum. He wanted to be the hero of his own story. This desire was the engine of his doom. It blinded him to the reality that the people he was planning to visit were not static museum pieces frozen in time, but living, breathing societies with complex legal systems, volatile politics, and long memories. When Michael looked at a map of Dutch New Guinea, he saw an adventure. He did not see a crime scene waiting to happen. The trap that snapped shut on Michael Rockefeller in 1961 was far removed from the boardrooms of Manhattan. Its mechanism was hidden in the steaming mangrove-choked coast of the Asmat region in what is now Indonesian Papua. In the late 1950s, this was one of the most remote, inhospitable, and terrified places on Earth. Geopolitically, it was a powder keg. It was officially a colony known as Dutch New Guinea, the last remnant of the Dutch East Indies Empire. But the Dutch hold on the territory was tenuous at best. They were clinging to a few coastal outposts surrounded by thousands of square miles of impenetrable swamp and jungle that they barely understood and certainly did not control. To the south, the newly independent nation of Indonesia was rattling its saber, threatening to invade and annex the territory. The Dutch administrators lived in a state of perpetual low-level panic, knowing their time was running out. The Asmat people, who inhabited this tidal wasteland of mud and silt, were unlike any society the Rockefellers had encountered in their European grand tours. They were warriors of the highest order, living in a world of stark duality. While they were master carvers capable of creating art of breathtaking complexity, their culture was simultaneously built entirely around the violence of the hunt. Their entire cosmology was built on a concept that anthropologists call reciprocity. In the Western mind, death is often seen as a biological event or God's will. In the Asmat worldview, death, unless it is of the very old, is never natural. It is always caused by malevolent magic or enemy action. Therefore, every death creates a spiritual imbalance, a deficit in the cosmic ledger. If a person dies, especially a leader or a warrior, their power is lost and the village is weakened. To restore balance, that power must be reclaimed. It is not reclaimed through prayer or meditation. It is reclaimed through hunting, specifically head hunting. The taking of an enemy's head was not an act of cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was a theological necessity. The skull was believed to contain the life force, or ndamup, and the brain was the seed of the name and identity. By killing an enemy, taking their head, and consuming the brain, the victor absorbed the name and power of the victim, adding it to their own. This allowed the spirits of the dead ancestors to finally rest. Without this payment of blood, the spirits of the dead would remain in the village, haunting the living, causing sickness, and preventing the sago trees from bearing fruit. This was the law of the jungle in its most literal and terrifying sense. A life for a life, a head for a head. A debt unpaid was a disaster for the entire community. Into this delicate, volatile ecosystem walked a man named Max Lapre. If Michael Rockefeller was the victim, Max Lapre was the unwitting executioner who set the stage 3 years prior. Lapre was a Dutch colonial patrol officer, a man described in administrative reports as rigid, paranoid, and fundamentally terrified of the people he was supposed to govern. He represented the dying gasp of European colonialism, authoritarian, violent, and deeply ignorant of local custom. The inciting incident of the Rockefeller murder, the forensic trigger that is often overlooked in casual retellings, occurred in 1958, 3 years before Michael ever set foot in New Guinea. Lapre was in charge of the government post near the Asmat village of Ochanep. Ochanep was a powerhouse of the region, a massive village of fierce warriors and intricate wood carvers who were proud, independent, and resistant to Dutch rule. Tensions between the colonial administration and the village had been simmering for months. The Dutch wanted to impose order and stop the intertribal headhunting raids. The Asmat wanted to be left alone to follow the laws of their ancestors. In February 1958, the paranoia reached a breaking point. Lapre, fearing an uprising, or simply seeking to assert dominance to mask his own insecurity, led a heavily armed police patrol into Ochanep. The details of the encounter remain shrouded in the fog of colonial cover-ups, but the outcome is an undisputed forensic fact. Chaos erupted. The Dutch patrol, armed with modern repeating rifles, opened fire on the villagers. They didn't just fire warning shots into the air, they fired to kill. When the smoke cleared and the screams faded, 5 high-ranking Asmat war leaders, known as Wawipits, lay dead in the mud. Their names were Yus, Angman, and 3 others, whose lineages held the spiritual weight of the community. For the Dutch, this was a police action, a regretful but necessary suppression of savages. Lapre filed a report. The administration buried the incident in paperwork to avoid international scrutiny, and they moved on. They assumed the fear of superior firepower would keep the Asmat in line. They assumed the lesson had been learned. They were catastrophically wrong. They had not taught a lesson. They had started a war they didn't even know they were fighting. For the people of Ochanep, the massacre was not a closed case. It was an open wound in the fabric of the universe. The death of 5 war leaders created a massive spiritual deficit. According to Asmat law, the spirits of these dead men could not move on to Safan, the land of the ancestors across the sea, until their deaths were avenged. They were stuck in a limbo, angry and restless, haunting the village, demanding payment. And the payment required was specific, because the leaders had been killed by white men, the Dutch. The reciprocity required the head of a white man. In the logic of the Asmat, all white men belonged to the same tribe. It didn't matter if the white man was Max Lapre, a missionary, a Dutch sailor, or a young billionaire heir from New York. They were all indistinguishable agents of the same ghostly power that had killed their leaders. For 3 years, the warriors of Ochanep waited. This period of waiting is critical to understanding the horror of what was to come. It wasn't passive, it was ritualistic. They carved bizpoles, towering wooden sculptures that stacked the figures of the unavenged dead on top of each other, pointing outward toward the sea, reminding the living of their duty to kill. They rehearsed the rituals. They sharpened their bamboo knives, made from the sharp edges of shells or bamboo splinters, capable of slicing flesh with surgical precision. They watched the horizon, waiting for the white tribe to make a mistake, to wander into their territory without the protection of their fire-spitting guns. The village was a coiled spring, held under tension by the unfulfilled mandate of their religion. This was the invisible, lethal landscape Michael Rockefeller entered in 1961. He arrived in New Guinea with the swagger of a man who believes his last name is a shield that can repel reality. He traveled as part of the Peabody Museum Harvard expedition, but he soon struck out on his own, eager to prove his independence. He traveled with cameras, endless supplies of trade goods, sticks of tobacco and steel axes, and a small entourage. Michael treated the Asmat villages as open-air art galleries. He moved from village to village buying thousands of artifacts, spears, shields, drums, and soul ships, shipping them back to his father's museum in New York in massive crates. He wrote letters home expressing his exhilaration, describing the Asmat as noble and wild, romanticizing them through the lens of a Western liberal. He wrote, "The Asmat is like a huge puzzle with the pieces fitting together. I am having a super successful time." He was blinded by his own privilege. He saw their art, but he missed their rage. He saw their smiles when he gave them steel axes. But he didn't understand that a steel axe to an Asmat warrior was not just a tool. It was a weapon upgrade that made headhunting more efficient. Crucially, Michael actually visited Achenep in the weeks before his disappearance. He walked among the very men who were plotting revenge against his race. He photographed them. He traded axes for their carvings. He stood in the Ju, the men's ceremonial house, surrounded by the skulls of previous victims. He didn't realize that when the warriors of Achenep looked at him, they weren't seeing a wealthy patron of the arts. They were seeing a walking, breathing opportunity to balance the cosmic scale. Michael was a high-value target in spiritual terms. He was young, strong, tall, and powerful, a perfect vessel to replace the lost energy of their murdered chiefs. He was, in their eyes, a white ghost sent by the sea to pay the debt. The tragedy of Michael Rockefeller is often framed by historians as an adventure gone wrong, a random accident of bad weather and bad luck. But forensic analysis suggests otherwise. It was a collision of two opposing historical forces, destined to meet on that muddy coastline. On one side, you had the Rockefeller dynasty, the apex of Western capitalism, operating on the belief that every corner of the earth could be bought, cataloged, and controlled. On the other side, you had the Asmat of Achenep, a society operating on the ancient, immutable laws of blood vengeance, carrying a 3-year-old debt that demanded payment in bone and brain. By November 1961, the trap was fully set. The spirits of Yus and Angmen were screaming for release. The warriors of Achenep were primed. The Dutch administration was distracted, preparing to hand the colony over to Indonesia and caring little for the safety of an American tourist. And Michael Rockefeller, driven by the need to impress his father and confident in his invincibility, was preparing for one last expedition down the coast in a rickety catamaran. He was about to step out of the protective bubble of his wealth and into a world where the only currency that mattered was the human head. The empire's arrogance had brought him to the edge of the abyss. The blood debt was waiting to pull him in. On the morning of November 18, 1961, the Arafura Sea presented a deceptive tranquility, a flat expanse of gray-green water masking the violent currents that churned beneath the surface, where the muddy outflow of the Islandan River meets the incoming oceanic tides. It was into this treacherous maritime theater that Michael Rockefeller steered his vessel, a makeshift catamaran that served as a floating metaphor for his own hubris. The boat was a clumsy hybrid of indigenous design and Western mechanics, consisting of two traditional Asmat dugout canoes, lashed together with wooden planks and powered by an 18-horsepower outboard motor. It was a vessel designed for the calm, silt-heavy rivers of the interior, not the open ocean. Yet Michael, driven by a frantic collector's gluttony to acquire artifacts from the distant Asmat villages down the coast, ignored the warnings of local sailors. He believed that his will, backed by the infinite resources of his family name, could overcome the immutable physics of the sea, a miscalculation that would cost him everything. On board with him were three men: René Wassing, a Dutch anthropologist who served as Michael's intellectual foil and voice of caution, and two young Asmat men named Leo and Simon, who served as guides and boatmen. As they motored away from the relative safety of the agate settlement, the sea began to heave with the terrifying unpredictability of the tropics. The tide in this region is a hydraulic monster. When the massive volume of river water collides with the incoming ocean tide, it creates turbulent standing waves known as tidal bores that can swamp a small craft in seconds. Around mid-morning, disaster struck with the sudden violent clarity of a thunderclap. A rogue wave, steep and heavy with silt, swamped the catamaran's low gunnels, flooding the stern and instantly killing the outboard motor. Silence descended, replaced immediately by the roar of the water and the frantic yanking of the starter cord. But the engine was drowned, now a dead weight. The heavy catamaran turned broadside to the waves, and a second impact pitched the vessel over, throwing the four men into the shark-infested water. They scrambled onto the slippery, overturned hulls of the dugout canoes, clinging to the wood as the boat began to drift. They were approximately 3 miles from shore at this point, a distance that seemed manageable, but the outgoing tide was ripping them seaward at a terrifying speed. It was here, in the first hour of the crisis, that the divergence in survival instincts became a matter of life and death, creating a stark forensic contrast between the civilized mind and the primal mind. Leo and Simon, the two Asmat guides, looked at the receding shore and did not calculate the odds. They felt them. They understood the law of the water in a way the two Western intellectuals never could. They knew that to wait was to die, that the ocean was not a neutral space but a hungry entity that would pull them into oblivion. Without a word of debate or hesitation, they grabbed empty plastic jerry cans to use as floats, slid into the water, and began to swim for the distant line of mangroves. They did not look back. They swam with the desperate, focused energy of men who knew that help would not come from the sky. Their decision was immediate and primal, and it saved them. They would eventually make it to shore, trekking through the jungle for days to reach help. Michael Rockefeller and René Wassing stayed. This was the first fatal error in the chain of events. Michael, the scion of a dynasty built on controlling outcomes and manipulating markets, believed that order would be restored. He was operating on Manhattan time, where rescue is a phone call away, and problems are solved by logistics. He believed that a patrol boat would come, or that the drift would reverse, or that his sheer presence would compel the universe to correct itself. But there were no phones. The Dutch patrol boats were miles away, and the sharks circling beneath their dangling legs did not care about the name Rockefeller. As the sun set on November 18th, the reality of their situation transformed from a logistical problem into a psychological horror story. The drift was relentless. By nightfall, the coast was a thin, dark line on the horizon, nearly 12 miles away, and the catamaran rocked in the swells, threatening to break apart with every wave. The night that followed was an eternity of sensory deprivation and terror. Phosphorescent plankton lit up the water around them, beautiful and terrifying, illuminating the shapes of large predators moving in the depths. This region is home to massive saltwater crocodiles and aggressive tiger sharks. Every splash, every bump against the hull sent a jolt of adrenaline through their exhausted bodies. Michael and Renee huddled together on the overturned hull, shivering in the deceptive tropical cold that seeps into the bones after hours of exposure. They spoke in circles, discussing their chances, their regrets, and the bitter irony of their predicament. Here was the heir to the Standard Oil fortune, a young man who could buy anything on earth, shivering in his underwear on a piece of driftwood, utterly powerless. The Rockefeller name, which opened doors in Manhattan and palaces in Europe, meant absolutely nothing to the Arafura Sea. The ocean did not care about his bank account. It only cared about his caloric output and his body temperature. The darkness stripped away the veneer of civilization, leaving them as nothing more than biological matter drifting in a void. When the sun rose on the morning of November 19th, the situation had deteriorated from desperate to hopeless. The coast was now a faint smudge, perhaps 12 to 14 miles away, and the current was pushing them further out into the open ocean, toward the Aru Islands and eventual oblivion. If they stayed with the boat, they would die of thirst and exposure long before they hit land. At 8 a.m., Michael Rockefeller made his choice. It was a decision born of physical confidence, impatience, and a lifetime of winning. Michael was a strong swimmer. He had been a champion athlete at Harvard and possessed a physicality that he took immense pride in. He looked at the distance and calculated the physics, convincing himself that he could conquer the gap. "I think I can make it," he told Wassing. Rene Wassing, older and more fatalistic, begged him not to go. He argued that the boat was their only visual signal for search planes, that the current was too strong, and that leaving the hull was suicide. But Michael was possessed by a restless energy. He could not sit still and wait to die. He had to act. It was the devil Bill gene kicking in, the refusal to be a victim, the need to cheat the odds. Michael prepared for the swim with a methodical calmness that belies the insanity of the act. He removed his khaki trousers and heavy shirt to reduce drag, remaining only in his cotton briefs, white fabric that would make him a high-contrast target in the dark water. He took 2 empty 5-gallon gasoline cans, jerry cans, tied them together with his belt and straps from the boat, and fashioned a crude buoyancy device. It was a makeshift life preserver, wings for a modern-day Icarus. "I think I can make it," he repeated, adjusting his thick black-rimmed glasses. He was nearly blind without them, and lowering himself into the water. "Good luck," Wassing said, his voice cracking. "I'll see you in Holland," Michael replied, a flash of the Rockefeller charm surfacing one last time. He pushed off. Wassing watched him go, a small head bobbing between 2 red jerry cans, slowly disappearing into the vast, indifferent blue. Wassing would eventually be rescued the next day by a Dutch patrol plane that spotted the wreckage, but by then Michael was gone. The forensic reconstruction of Michael Rockefeller's swim is a testament to the extraordinary capabilities of the human body when pushed to its limit. He was not swimming in a pool. He was swimming in a dynamic, hostile environment. The distance was approximately 12 miles, almost 20 kilometers. He was fighting a cross-current that constantly tried to sweep him out to sea. He had to swim at an angle, ferrying against the tide, a feat of navigation that required constant mental calculation even as his body began to fail. For the first few hours, adrenaline fueled him, but as the sun climbed to its zenith, the torture began. The tropical sun hammered down on his exposed back and head, causing rapid dehydration and severe sunburn. The salt water attacked the mucous membranes of his mouth and eyes. His muscles, burning through their glycogen stores, would have begun to cramp, screaming for relief. But the greatest enemy was not the sun or the fatigue. It was the mind. In the silence of the open ocean, hallucinations would have set in. He likely heard the phantom sounds of boat engines or saw shapes in the water that weren't there. Every shadow beneath him was a potential predator. Yet, he kept kicking, stroke after stroke, hour after hour. This swim was a superhuman feat. It effectively lasted from 8 a.m. until late afternoon, perhaps 10 to 12 hours of continuous physical exertion. Most men would have drowned from exhaustion. Most men would have given up and let the current take them. But Michael Rockefeller did not drown. By late afternoon on November 19th, the miracle occurred. The water changed color, shifting from the deep, clear blue of the ocean to the murky brown silt of the coastal discharge. He felt the temperature change. He smelled the smoke of cooking fires and the rot of the mangroves. He had done it. Against all odds, against the currents, against the sharks, Michael Rockefeller touched the bottom. His feet sank into the thick gray mud of the Asmat coast. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and sunblind, but he was alive. He dragged himself through the tidal mudflats, the razor-sharp mangrove roots tearing at his skin. He had conquered nature. He had proven that a Rockefeller could survive anything. As he pulled himself onto the muddy bank, he must have felt a surge of triumph. He was safe. He was on land. However, forensic geography reveals a terrifying irony that turned his triumph into a death sentence. Michael did not wash up on an empty beach, nor did he wash up near a Dutch patrol post. The currents had guided him with malicious precision to a specific stretch of coastline, the mouth of the Utah River. This was the exact territory of the Asmat village, the very village that was still mourning the 5 chiefs massacred by the Dutch 3 years prior. As Michael lay there in the mud, gasping for air, peering through his salt-encrusted glasses, he likely saw figures approaching from the jungle. He would have seen the silhouettes of men holding spears and paddles. His heart likely soared with relief. He saw rescuers. He saw the locals he had traded with. He waved to them. He called out. He assumed, with the final fatal arrogance of his upbringing, that these men would see a distressed human being in need of aid. He assumed they would see a Tuan, a white master, to be respected. He was wrong. The men approaching him were not rescuers. They were the warriors of Achenep, Finn, Ajim, Pep, and the other leaders of the village. They had been patrolling the coast, keeping an eye out for Dutch ships, their hearts still burning with the shame of the unavenged massacre. When they looked at the exhausted, exposed white man lying in the mud, they saw neither Michael Rockefeller nor a human being in need of aid. Instead, they saw a gift from the sea. They saw a liminal being, something between human and spirit, delivered by the tide to settle the score. They saw the ghost of the white tribe offering his neck for the blade. Michael Rockefeller had swum through hell to escape death by drowning, only to crawl straight into the waiting arms of his executioners. He had survived the ocean, but he would not survive the blood debt. The swim was over. The ritual was about to begin. By the late afternoon of November 19th, 1961, the Arafura Sea had settled into a deceptive, glassy calm, the violent swells of the previous day replaced by the suffocating humidity of the tidal swamps. Michael Rockefeller lay slumped in the gray, sulfurous mud at the mouth of the Utah River, a figure of absolute physical depletion. He was stripped down to his underwear, his skin burned raw and blistering from 10 hours of equatorial sun exposure, his eyes swollen and stinging from salt, his body trembling with the uncontrollable rigors of hypothermia and exhaustion. But he was alive. His chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. In his delirious state, peering through his thick, salt-crusted, black-rimmed glasses, the sight of a long, dugout canoe rounding the bend of the river must have looked like a divine intervention, a miracle delivered at the end point of his endurance. There were 8 men in the boat, strong, muscular figures standing with paddles and spears, their silhouettes sharp against the fading, bruised purple light of the dusk. To Michael's Western mind, conditioned by a lifetime of transactional safety and the unshakable belief that his surname commanded respect, these were rescuers. He stood up on shaky legs, fighting the gravity that sought to pull him back into the silt, waved his arms, and called out in the few words of local dialect he knew. He assumed, with the tragic optimism of the civilized man, that they would see a Rockefeller in distress. He assumed they would see a Tuan, a white master, and offer him water, shelter, and passage to the Dutch outpost. He was tragically, fatally wrong. The men in the canoe were not fishermen, nor were they random passers-by. They were the Wau-ipits, the war leaders of Ochanep, the most feared and powerful village on the entire Casuarina coast. Among them were Pep, Ajim, and Finn, warriors who carried the heavy, suffocating spiritual burden of the unavenged massacre of 1958. For 3 years, since the Dutch patrol officer Max Lapre had gunned down their fathers and brothers, these men had lived in a state of spiritual siege. The ghosts of their dead leaders were screaming for blood, blocking the path to the afterlife, preventing the sago palm from flourishing, and causing sickness in the village. They had carved bispoles, stacked with the images of the unavenged dead, pointing them out to sea, begging for a victim. When these men looked at the pale, emaciated, sun-bleached figure rising from the mud of the riverbank, they did not see a man in need of aid. They did not see a human being at all. In the intricate, terrifying cosmology of the Asmat, the sea is the realm of the spirits, and the dead, the Safan. For a white entity to emerge from the water, at the exact location where their chiefs had been gunned down by white colonial officers 3 years prior, was not a coincidence. It was a cosmic delivery. It was a liminal being, a creature sent by the ancestors to offer itself for the balancing of the world. The warriors stopped paddling. The canoe drifted closer, the silence of the jungle amplifying the tension of the moment. There was a brief, hushed conference among the men, a quick exchange of glances and whispers that weighed the spiritual magnitude of what stood before them. Finn, the war leader who had lost family in the Dutch raid and whose rage was the most potent, looked at Michael and allegedly uttered the sentence that sealed the Americans' fate, a decree of execution that reverberated through the history of the tribe. Today is our day. The execution was swift, brutal, and devoid of hesitation. Beyond the legal definition of murder, to the Asmat, this was a harvest. As Michael waded waist-deep into the water toward the boat, perhaps reaching out a hand in gratitude, perhaps realizing too late the lack of recognition in their eyes, Ajim stood up. He held a long fishing spear, its tip carved from ironwood or sharpened bone, designed to pierce the thick hide of crocodiles. With a sudden practiced thrust, he drove the spear into Michael's side. He aimed with anatomical precision for the floating ribs, the vulnerable point below the rib cage where the bone structure gives way to soft tissue, allowing direct access to the vital organs. Michael gasped, likely too shocked and exhausted to scream, as the steel or bone of the spearhead pierced his liver and diaphragm. The air left his lungs. He fell back into the opaque water, the splash marking the end of the Rockefeller dynasty's power in this corner of the world. The other men moved instantly like a pack of wolves springing a trap. They did not recoil, They swarmed. They dragged his thrashing, bleeding body out of the water and hauled him into the bottom of the long canoe. He was not dead yet, but his status had fundamentally changed. He was no longer a person. He was now prey. As he lay in the bottom of the boat, looking up at the canopy of the darkening sky, choking on his own blood, Finn raised a heavy stone axe, a tool from the Neolithic age, and brought it down on the back of Michael's neck. The blow severed the cervical vertebrae, crushing the spinal cord and extinguishing the life of the richest young man on earth in a fraction of a second. What followed was not a chaotic frenzy of violence, but a disciplined, highly ritualistic procedure that had been refined over centuries of headhunting culture. The warriors did not take the body back to the village of Oceanep immediately. That would have been spiritually dangerous and politically reckless, risking the attention of the Dutch patrol boats. Instead, they paddled their heavy cargo to a secluded, winding creek known as Omadisep, a hidden tributary shielded by dense walls of nipa palms and mangrove roots. This was the abattoir, the sacred space where the transformation from human to spirit, from enemy to ancestor, would occur. Forensic anthropology, combined with the later hushed testimony of tribal elders obtained by investigators like Carl Hoffman, allows us to reconstruct the anatomy of this ritual with terrifying clinical precision. They pulled the canoe onto the mud bank, hidden from the eyes of the world, and unloaded their prize. The first step was purification. They gathered dried palm fronds and built a fire on the muddy bank. They did not burn the body, they singed it. They passed the fire over Michael's skin, burning off the fine hairs of his arms and legs, blistering the outer layer of the epidermis. This was the exact same method used to prepare a wild boar for butchering, a symbolic act that stripped the victim of his individual human identity and reduced him to meat, to a vessel of potential energy. Then the dismantling began. The Asmat possessed a sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy, learned through generations of warfare. They did not hack wildly, they dissected. They started with the head, the seat of the soul. Using bamboo knives, slivers of bamboo that are sharper than steel scalpels when freshly cut, they made a circular incision around the neck. They twisted the head until the vertebrae separated, removing it from the torso. This was the primary trophy, the vessel of the Endamup life force they so desperately needed to reclaim. But the body was not discarded. In a world where protein was scarce and spiritual power was transferable, nothing was wasted. They systematically butchered the torso and limbs. The arms and legs were removed at the joints. The torso was opened, the ribs cracked apart, and the entrails were removed. The liver, heart, and lungs, the organs of vitality, were set aside for the elders. The strips of meat from the thighs and biceps, the strongest muscles of the white giant, were carved off and placed in woven bags. But the core of the ritual, the moment of supreme theological importance, centered on the skull. Finn, holding Michael's severed head, performed the most delicate operation of all. He peeled back the scalp and facial skin, likely saving it to be dried or worn, though the skull itself was the ultimate prize. To access the brain, the literal seat of the victim's power and identity, the Asmat did not smash the cranium with a rock, as that would disrespect the trophy and ruin its aesthetic value. Instead, they used a specialized tool, often a bone chisel or a sharp stone, to hammer a small, precise hole in the temple, or they widened the foramen magnum, the large opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord enters. Through this aperture, they extracted the brain tissue. This gray matter was not eaten raw. It was mixed with sago worms, fat white beetle larvae that are the staple fat source of the Asmat diet and are considered a delicacy. The mixture of human brain and insect larvae was wrapped in sago leaves, creating a cylindrical packet and roasted over the fire. This dish served as the sacrament, the physical manifestation of the blood debt. Far from simple hunger, this act was a communion. As the warriors of Asmat consumed the brain of Michael Rockefeller, they believed they were ingesting his vitality, his courage, his immense size, and his name. They were filling the void left by their dead chiefs. It was a transubstantiation far more literal and visceral than anything in the Catholic Mass. They believed that by eating him, they were preventing his spirit from wandering and taking vengeance upon them. They were absorbing him into the collective soul of the village. The distribution of the remains followed a strict social hierarchy. The meat was shared among the families of the boat crew, ensuring that the guilt and the power was distributed throughout the clan. This communal consumption served a secondary forensic purpose. It ensured silence. No one could betray the secret to the Dutch or the Rockefeller family because everyone had tasted the flesh. To speak of it would be to implicate oneself in the consumption of the white man. The entire village became accomplices in the act, bound together by the taste of the billionaire. The bones were not buried, they were repurposed. The Asmat are a culture of wood and bone. They live in the Stone Age where hard materials are precious. The long bones of Michael's thighs, femurs, and shins, tibias, were cleaned, polished, and fashioned into daggers, and the tips of fishing spears. There is a profound, sickening irony here that echoes through the decades. Michael Rockefeller had come to New Guinea to collect artifacts. He had come to buy spears and daggers to hang on the walls of a museum in Manhattan. Instead, he was transformed into artifacts. His bones became the very objects he sought to possess. His ribs were likely kept as charms, distributed among the men. His skull stripped of flesh and the lower jaw, which is often removed and worn as an armband by the killer to silence the ghost, would have been hung in the rafters of the Jeu, the men's ceremonial house, watching over the village as a silent guardian. The final stage of the ritual was the naming. The Asmat do not believe a name should die. When they killed a powerful enemy, they would often adopt his name or assign the name of the dead ancestor he replaced. It is believed, based on the chants heard in the village in the weeks following the disappearance, that the warriors referred to Michael's skull as Indara, the name of one of the powerful chiefs killed by Max Lapre in 1958. By eating Michael, they had essentially resurrected Indara. The circle was closed. The spiritual deficit was balanced. The ghosts that had haunted Asmat for 3 years were finally at peace, fed by the blood of a billionaire. As the dawn of November 20th broke over the jungle, the fires at Autopsy burned down to embers. The canoe returned to the village, lighter in physical weight but heavier with spiritual power. The jungle swallowed the secret. There was no body left to find, no clothes, no glasses, no trace. Michael Rockefeller had been completely metabolized by the Stone Age. He had ceased to exist as an American citizen, as a Harvard graduate, as an heir to Standard Oil. He had become part of the blood, bone, and myth of the Asmat people. The sacred feast was over. The warriors washed the blood from their hands in the river, the same river that had delivered their victim. They returned to their wives and children, their duty discharged. They did not know they had killed a Rockefeller. They only knew they had killed a white ghost, and that the world was right again. The silence of the swamp returned, hiding the evidence of the most expensive meal in human history, waiting for the search planes that were already beginning to circle overhead, looking for a man who was no longer there. If the events of November 19th, 1961, at the mouth of the Utah River were a tragedy of primal violence, The events that followed were a tragedy of civilized corruption. The murder of Michael Rockefeller was a brutal physical act committed by men with stone axes. But the erasure of Michael Rockefeller was a sophisticated bureaucratic act committed by men in suits, uniforms, and clerical robes. As the smoke from the roasting fires at Amadisep Creek faded into the jungle canopy, a second machine began to turn, a machine fueled not by blood vengeance, but by geopolitical necessity and dynastic pride. This was the Great Cover-Up, a conspiracy of silence that spanned 3 continents and kept the truth buried in a shallow grave of classified files for more than 50 years. The official response began with the arrival of the cavalry. On November 24, 1961, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York and one of the most powerful men in the Western world, landed in Maroc, Dutch New Guinea. He brought with him a chartered Boeing 707, a frantic press corps, and the full weight of the American political establishment. For 10 days, the Arafura Sea was churned white by the propellers of Dutch Navy ships, Australian helicopters, and private search planes. It was the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the South Pacific. The world watched with bated breath as the grieving father scoured the jungle for his golden son. But it was theater. While the planes were looking for a raft or a survivor waving from the beach, the truth was already circulating in the mud below, whispered in a language the searchers did not speak. The first cracks in the official story appeared almost immediately, but they appeared in the one place the cameras weren't looking: the confessionals and mission houses of the Catholic Church. 2 Dutch missionaries, Father Hubertus von Page and Father Cornelius van Kessel, had spent years living among the Asmat. They spoke the language, understood the intricate web of tribal politics, and, most importantly, they were the keepers of the tribe's secrets. While Nelson Rockefeller was flying overhead, Father von Page was on the ground, navigating the tense, hushed atmosphere of the villages. In early December 1961, just weeks after the disappearance, Father von Page began to receive visitors. Terrified villagers from the settlements neighboring Ochaneb came to him in the dead of night. They did not come to confess sins. They came to unburden themselves of a terrifying secret that threatened to bring down the wrath of the spirits. They told the priest that the warriors of Ochaneb had returned from a patrol with a big catch. They described in graphic detail the killing of a tall white man at the mouth of the Utah River. They named the killers Finn, Ajim, Pep, and Dombai. They described the division of the body parts. Most damning of all, they described the trophies. They told the priest that the warriors were now in possession of the white man's iron eyes, his glasses, and his short skins, his white underwear. Father von Page was a man of God, but he was also a realist. He knew immediately that this was not a tall tale. The details were too specific, the fear too palpable. He wrote a detailed report to his superior, Bishop Alphonse Sawada, and to the Dutch colonial administration. In a cable that should have blown the case wide open, he wrote, "Michael Rockefeller has been murdered and eaten by the Ochaneb Asmat. It was an act of revenge for the 1958 police raid." At the same time, Father Cornelius van Kessel was receiving similar intelligence. He wrote to his family in the Netherlands, stating unequivocally, "Michael was murdered. They have his head. There is no doubt." These 2 priests had solved the mystery before the search was even officially called off. They had the motive, the method, the names of the perpetrators, and the location of the remains. So why did the world continue to believe for 50 years that Michael Rockefeller drowned? The answer lies in the volatile geology of the Cold War. In 1961, Dutch New Guinea was not just a remote colony, it was a geopolitical chessboard. The Netherlands was desperately trying to hold on to its last foothold in the East Indies, planning to grant the Papuans independence to prevent the territory from being swallowed by the aggressive pro-communist regime of Indonesia under President Sukarno. The Dutch argument to the United Nations was that they were civilizing the Papuans, preparing them for modern democracy. The news that the noble savages under their protection had just headhunted and eaten the son of the most famous capitalist in America would have been a catastrophic PR disaster. It would have proved the Indonesian argument that the Dutch had no control, that the territory was a lawless chaos, and that the Papuans were savages in need of Indonesian discipline. A cannibalism scandal involving a Rockefeller would have destroyed the Dutch colonial mandate overnight. When the reports from Father von Page and Father van Kessel reached the desk of the Dutch governor in Hollandia, a decision was made. It was a cold bureaucratic calculation. The truth was inconvenient. Therefore, the truth had to die. The administration classified the reports. They ordered the priests to remain silent for the good of the mission and the safety of the region. The police were told to cease investigating the murder angle. The official narrative would be death by drowning. It was a clean, tragic, and politically sterile conclusion. But the cover-up required more than just ignoring reports. It required the suppression of physical evidence. This brings us to the tragic figure of Wim van de Wal, a tough, cynical Dutch patrol officer who refused to play the game. In early 1962, months after Nelson Rockefeller had returned to New York, Van de Wal was sent into Oceanep to investigate. He wasn't looking for a drowning victim. He was looking for a corpse. Through a mix of intimidation and negotiation, Van de Wal managed to break the silence of the village. The warriors of Oceanep were terrified. They believed the spirit of Michael, whom they called Indara, was causing illness in the village because the ritual hadn't been completed perfectly, or perhaps because the white tribe was angry. In an act of desperation, the tribe handed over evidence. According to multiple sources and later investigations, Van de Wal obtained physical remains. Some accounts say he was given the skull itself. Others say he recovered the femur bones that had been turned into daggers, along with Michael's distinctively thick glasses. Van de Wal returned to the capital triumphant. He had solved the crime of the century. He had the proof. What happened next is the most chilling chapter of the bureaucratic horror. Instead of holding a press conference, the Dutch authorities confiscated the evidence. The skull, or the bones, disappeared into the black hole of the colonial archives, never to be seen again. Van de Wal was ordered to keep his mouth shut and was eventually transferred out of the region. The file was stamped secret, and the lid was slammed shut. The Dutch successfully handed New Guinea over to the United Nations, and later Indonesia, in late 1962. Their reputation battered but intact, the cannibal scandal successfully averted. But what about the Rockefellers? What did Nelson know? It is inconceivable that a man of Nelson Rockefeller's resources and intelligence network did not hear the whispers. The rumors of his son's grisly end were circulating in diplomatic circles within weeks. Yet publicly, Nelson clung to the drowning theory with a rigid determination. Why? Forensic psychology suggests that for the Rockefeller dynasty, the truth was simply too grotesque to bear. To lose a son to the ocean is a tragedy. It is poetic, clean, and final. It places the death in the realm of man against nature. But to acknowledge that the heir to the Rockefeller fortune, the prince of capitalism, had been butchered, cooked, and consumed by a Stone Age tribe was a humiliation that struck at the very core of the family's identity. It turned the Rockefeller power into a joke. It stripped Michael of his dignity and reduced him to food. It was easier to accept a dead son than a devoured one. Nelson Rockefeller, the pragmatist, likely made the same calculation as the Dutch government. The search was called off. Michael was declared legally dead by drowning in 1964. The family closed ranks. They never returned to New Guinea. They never publicly acknowledged the reports from the missionaries. They chose the comfortable lie over the horrific truth. The silence held for 50 years. The jungle grew over the secrets of Asmat. The Dutch left, the Indonesians took over, and the world moved on. Michael Rockefeller became a trivia question, a myth, a ghost story told around campfires. It wasn't until 2014, with the publication of Carl Hoffman's seminal book, Savage Harvest, that the seal was finally broken. Hoffman did what no one had done since Wim van de Waal. He went back. He didn't just look at the archives, he went to Asmat. He lived with the sons and grandsons of the men who killed Michael. He learned the language, and slowly, painfully, the truth bled out. Hoffman found the descendants of Finn, Pep, and Ajim living in a shadow of fear. They believed their village was cursed. They told him the story not as a rumor, but as history. They mimed the spearing. They described the location. They named the men. Hoffman found that the memory of the white ghost was still vivid, a dark trauma that had defined the village for generations. He cross-referenced these oral histories with the declassified Dutch archives, finding the suppressed reports of Father van Page and the testimony of van de Waal. The puzzle pieces fit perfectly. The forensic conclusion of Part 5 is a verdict on the power of institutions to manufacture reality. Michael Rockefeller did not just die once. He was killed by the Asmat spear in 1961, but then he was killed a second time by the Dutch government in 1962, who erased the evidence to save their colony. And he was killed a third time by his own family, who chose to bury the truth to save their pride. The great cover-up was not a single act, but a collaborative effort between the primitive and the civilized world to ensure that the scream of the young billionaire in the jungle was never heard. Justice in this case was not denied by the lack of evidence. It was denied by the abundance of politics. The file was closed, the skull was hidden, and the lie became history. But as the saying goes, three things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. The ghost of Michael Rockefeller refused to stay underwater. The saga of the Rockefeller dynasty does not end with the silence of the New Guinea jungle in 1961, nor does it conclude with the bureaucratic shuffling of classified papers in Dutch archives. It ends 18 years later in a luxury townhouse in Manhattan, with a scene so farcical and scandalous that it finally shattered the family's carefully cultivated image of Protestant rectitude. If Michael Rockefeller's death was a tragedy of primal violence, the death of his father, Nelson Rockefeller, was a tragedy of decadent hypocrisy. The collapse of the Rockefeller myth is best illustrated by the final hours of the patriarch who failed to save his son. It reveals the perfect, terrifying symmetry of a curse that began with snake oil and ended in shame. On the night of January 26, 1979, Nelson Rockefeller, the former Vice President of the United States and the unspoken emperor of the American establishment, was not, as his press team would later claim, working late at his office on a scholarly book about art. He was at his private townhouse on West 54th Street, a sanctuary of wealth filled with the very primitive art he had spent a lifetime collecting. He was 70 years old, a man who had spent decades projecting an image of vigorous, masculine power and unshakable moral authority. But he was not alone with his art collection. He was in the company of Megan Marshak, a 25-year-old aide who had become the object of his final, consuming obsession. The official story released the next morning was a masterclass in the Rockefeller reflex, the instinct to lie to protect the brand at all costs. The family spokesman solemnly told the world that Nelson had collapsed at his desk at Rockefeller Center, surrounded by security guards and staff, working tirelessly for the public good until his final breath. It was a noble, statesman-like death befitting a king. It was also a complete fabrication. The truth, excavated by relentless police reporters and medical examiners in the days that followed, was far tawdrier. Nelson had suffered a massive heart attack not at his desk, but in a private bedroom. He was not wearing a suit and tie. He was found in a state of partial undress. And the person who called 911 was not a security guard, but the young Megan Marshak, who allegedly waited nearly an hour before dialing the emergency number. Forensic analysis of that missing hour reveals the panic of the cover-up. Why wait? Because the priority was not to save the man. The priority was to save the reputation. In those chaotic 60 minutes, clothes were rearranged, scenes were staged, and the evidence of the affair was sanitized. Just as the family had tried to bury the truth about Michael's cannibalization to save their political standing, they now tried to bury the circumstances of Nelson's death to save their moral standing. But this time, the cover-up failed. The press, emboldened by the post-Watergate era, tore the story apart. The king had died in the arms of his mistress, while his wife, Happy Murphy, the one for whom he had destroyed his first marriage and his presidential chances, was sitting alone in another residence. The headline, "Nelson thought he was coming, but he was going," became a playground joke. The dignity of the dynasty, built over a century, evaporated in a cloud of tabloid laughter. This sordid end serves as the final forensic exhibit in our autopsy of the House of Rockefeller. It forces us to connect the dots across 4 generations, revealing a pattern not of success, but of deepening pathology. When we view the lineage as a continuous narrative rather than separate lives, a terrifying evolution of sin becomes visible. The corruption began with the root, William Devil Bill Rockefeller, whose crime was fraud. He was a man who sold poison as medicine, viewing his own children as marks to be swindled and teaching them that truth is malleable and other people exist only to be exploited. This genetic code of deceit did not die with him. It mutated. It passed to the second generation, John D. Rockefeller, whose crime was predation. He took the chaotic fraud of his father and industrialized it, cheating not just individuals, but the entire free market. He destroyed the livelihoods of thousands of independent refiners, justifying the carnage with a cold religious narcissism that claimed he was the chosen instrument of God's economy. The pathology then escalated to the third generation, Nelson Rockefeller, whose crime was arrogance. He took the money of John D. and the deceit of Devil Bill and applied it to the world stage, believing he could control nations, manipulate art history, and rewrite the truth. He founded the museum that sent Michael to his death, managed the cover-up that erased the murder, and finally died living a lie, proving that beneath the veneer of the statesman was the same impulsive, self-indulgent appetite that drove his grandfather. Finally, the bill came due with the fourth generation, Michael Rockefeller. He was not a perpetrator in this lineage. He was the victim, the sacred offering. In the ancient concept of karma, or what the Asmat call the balance of souls, debt does not disappear, it accumulates. For 3 generations, the Rockefellers had extracted oil from the earth, extracted money from competitors, extracted art from indigenous cultures. They had taken and taken without ever paying the spiritual price. Michael became the payment. He was the golden child, the innocent heir who carried the weight of the family name into a place where that name meant nothing. The Asmat warriors didn't know they were killing a Rockefeller, but in a cosmic sense, they were the agents of a delayed justice. They treated him exactly as the Rockefellers had treated the world, as a resource to be consumed. This leads us to the final, uncomfortable comparison between jungle law and Wall Street law. Throughout history, the West has looked down on the Asmat as savages and cannibals, using Michael's death as proof of their barbarity. But a forensic comparison of the two cultures yields a startling verdict. When the Asmat killed Michael Rockefeller, they did so out of a rigid sense of justice. They believed they were righting a wrong, the murder of their fathers by the Dutch. It was a ritualistic act bound by strict rules intended to restore harmony to their universe. They didn't kill him for his watch or his money. They killed him for his soul, believing that the balance of the world depended on it. Contrast this with the civilized violence of the Rockefellers. When John D. Rockefeller ordered the Cleveland Massacre of 1872, starving rival families into bankruptcy and leading to suicides and ruin, his motivation was profit, not justice. Similarly, when Nelson Rockefeller covered up the truth of his son's death, he acted not for spiritual harmony, but for political expediency. The Asmat consumed one body to honor their ancestors. The Rockefeller Empire consumed millions of lives. Workers, competitors, soldiers in colonial conflicts to feed the god of capital. Who then is the true savage? The warrior who kills to balance the sky, or the tycoon who kills to balance a ledger? The story of the Rockefeller curse is not merely a history lesson, it is a warning. It stands as a monument to the limitations of power. Michael Rockefeller believed his money was a shield. He believed his catamaran, his outboard motor, and his family name would protect him from the currents of the Arafura Sea. He was wrong. The ocean is indifferent to net worth. The shark does not check the stock market, and the Asmat spear does not discriminate between a pauper and a prince. The tragedy proved that there are forces in this world, primal, spiritual, and physical, that cannot be bought, bribed, or intimidated. Today, if you walk through Rockefeller Center in New York City, you will see the golden statue of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods. It is a symbol of human striving, of the Rockefeller belief in their own divinity and their right to rule. But if you were to travel 10,000 miles away to the muddy swamps of the Casuarina coast, you would find a different reality. You would find a silence that swallows everything. Somewhere in that mud, or perhaps hidden in the rafters of a decaying longhouse, lie the glasses and the bones of the boy who flew too close to the sun. The dynasty remains, of course. The name is still plastered on universities, hospitals, and banks. The money is still there, insulated by trusts and armies of lawyers. But the aura is gone. The myth of invincibility died in 1961, eaten alive on a riverbank. The scandal of 1979 buried the remains of the family's moral authority. The file is finally closed. The autopsy is complete. The verdict is clear. You can buy the world, but you cannot bribe the dark. The debt in the end is always paid in blood.